Hi friends, my name is Lord Allen of House Generation Films. Today we delve back into the wonderfully stabby world of Game of Thrones. Last time we took a deep look at the Battle of Winterfell, the final battle of Game of Thrones where the producers actually gave a crap. In all fairness, Weiss and Benioff are moving on to do a Star Wars film, which is great. But respect the fans, guys. Finish the damn series before you head off to do something else. I'm not even sure I want them touching Star Wars. I mean, we've had more than our fair share of misfires recently. Anyway, during our analysis of the Battle of Winterfell, we came to the conclusion that Jon Snow, King Lord Commander, Warden of the North, Night's Watch, Last of the Dragons, is not all that bright. He's an extraordinarily brave and honorable guy, and in general, one of the few decent and likable people left in Westeros, but he has a very limited grasp on battlefield tactics and strategy.
You know nothing, Jon Snow.
Actually, no, he completely ignores battlefield strategy and tactics. Jon Snow is a choo-choo train on tracks and only knows how to charge straight at an enemy. Any sideways or lateral movement is considered cowardice or witchcraft. Had Arya Stark not assassin created the Night King with an epic dragger drop and stab move that I will try the next time my wife tries to deny me access to a hamburger, humanity would have been screwed and our history would have been wiped out. Well, I guess there still would have been Essos, but Essos really sucks. If the stone disease or slavers don't get you, the marauding bands of horse people will, and then they'll probably try to mount you. Yeah, so Westeros needs to be saved, but just not by Jon Snow. I'm actually confused why he was put in command in the first place. Oh yeah, that's because Daenerys also doesn't know how to command troops in battle, but in all fairness, Jon Snow's history of command is terrible. Just recently, he led a small group of soldiers into the north on a mission to capture a walker, which ultimately was pointless. They get surrounded by hundreds of thousands of White Walkers and have to be rescued by Daenerys' dragons. Not only does this lead to the death of a dragon,
we got a Black Hawk down,
and half of the scouting party, Jon Snow doesn't even make it back because he's too busy hacking White Walkers. One might think that he's being heroic and acting as a rear guard, but upon closer inspection, no he isn't. Everyone is safely on the dragon, patiently waiting for Jon as he continues to charge away from the dragon. Luckily, Jon Snow is incredibly hard to kill and survives. His near immortality and lack of fear for death has probably really messed with his decision-making abilities. It's almost like he's playing a video game, but not a hard game like Souls, but maybe Dynasty Warriors? This most likely is the result of being stabbed to death by his men for an unpopular decision he made as Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and then being brought back to life. Once you conquer death, nothing else really scares you much. But being scared of death is an important thing because it prevents us from doing stupid, reckless things all the time. Which brings us to his actions and terrible command during the Battle of the Bastards.
You know nothing, Jon Snow.
The setup is great. Classic Game of Thrones. The two main bastards in Westeros face off against each other. On one side we have Ramsay Bolton, who by all accounts is a psychopath. He only recently came to power after murdering his father Roose Bolton and then feeding his stepmom and stepbrother to his hounds. His father Roose was also a backstabbing murderer, a former bannerman of the Starks. He killed Robb Stark at the Red Wedding and then took over Winterfell and became the Warden of the North. No one really likes the Boltons, and everyone definitely is afraid and hates Ramsay. But there's no denying that the bastard is quite a capable commander, primarily because of his ruthlessness. Ramsay holds Winterfell with around 5,000 soldiers. He has additional 1,000 soldiers from the Umbers and Karstarks. Most of these soldiers are armed with spears and large shields, but the Boltons also have medium sword cavalry units along with a company of archers. The Stark, on the other hand, only have 2,400 soldiers, the majority of their forces made up of wildlings. Ferocious if not undisciplined soldiers, they're lightly armored and heavily armed with usually axes and swords. A few hundred of Stark's men are from minor houses and they include a mix of cavalry, archers, and men-at-arms armed with shields and melee weapons. Now the Starks are clearly at a disadvantage. They must take Winterfell, one of the better designed castles in Westeros. It's generally accepted that attacking forces will require around 2 to 3 times the amount of soldiers as the defenders fighting behind fortifications. In this case, not only are the Starks outnumbered, a siege would probably be a bad idea because winter is coming and even wildlings need shelter from the very cold weather. They also lack engineers, it seems, so building anything but the most rudimentary siege devices will have to suffice. But this is where Ramsay Bolton makes a very critical, if not understandable, mistake. Bolton decides to leave a small garrison in Winterfell and approaches the Starks on the battlefield instead. He clearly has superior numbers and better armed soldiers and could have waited in his castle. But he also isn't the most legitimate ruler of the North. They might both be bastards, but Jon is loved by the common man. Ramsay must crush any attempt to usurp him. If he hides behind his walls and shows cowardice, the other houses might unite behind the Starks. Ramsay is only the ruler right now because he has power and fear on his side. The second he loses that, the people of the North will turn against him. Of course, Ramsay isn't a moron. If he's gonna march out to face Jon Snow's army, he's gonna take full advantage of his numbers and win a clean and flawless battle. The stories of Jon Snow must be pretty widespread by now. Like his father Ned, Jon was all about honor and doing the right thing, even if it's not the most logical thing. Ramsay, of course, sees this as a major flaw and tries to goad Jon into acting rashly. With their forces facing each other in the open field, Ramsay parades Rickon Stark, the youngest Stark, in front of both armies and allows him to run to his brother. Jon might have been raised as a bastard, but he really loves his family. And so he recklessly charges out in front of his own forces in an attempt to grab Rickon before Ramsay can skewer him with an arrow. Ramsay, who is an exceptionally skilled archer, allows Rickon to run to the middle of the battlefield. This is important. Ramsay could have easily killed Rickon immediately, but then Jon Snow would have stopped far away from the Bolton lines. Instead, Ramsay allows Jon to catch up with Rickon right in the middle of the battlefield before he cuts him down. Now, the logical man would have been very angry, of course, seeing his stepbrother getting killed, but he also would have realized that he was standing alone in the middle of a field, facing potentially hundreds of archers. But Jon Snow is not a logical man. He locks eyes with Ramsay and, to the dismay of his own commanders, rushes full on towards the enemy. I understand Jon Snow's urge to save his brother. I imagine I'd do the same. But after I failed, I wouldn't charge the enemy all by myself. That's just suicidal. So Ramsay's ploy has worked. Sir Davos has no choice but to commit the rest of Stark's army into a frontal assault in an attempt to save Jon. Their disorganized charge must break through Ramsay's own carefully deployed forces. Battlefield plans usually fall apart immediately, but in this case, the Boltons had the Starks playing right into their hands. Jon Snow somehow manages to survive a massive barrage of arrows, but his horse isn't as lucky. Now on foot, wielding nothing more than a longsword, he must face down the bulk of the Bolton cavalry charge. If Jon Snow is killed, the battle might end immediately. Jon finally realizes the fatal flaw he has committed himself to and accepts his death, but before he's swept away, his own cavalry meets the Bolton forces in an awesome collision of man, horse, and steel. It's a result of terrible tactics and strategies, but it's also an amazing moment. As stupid as Jon Snow is, you gotta commend the guy for being an incredible leader. His men will follow him to the edge of the flat earth. Now, I realize that fighting under Roose Bolton would give me a better chance of surviving, but I would probably follow Jon Snow over him for that reason. Now, Ramsay has engaged his cavalry forces in a frontal charge in order to kill the enemy general. It exposes his cavalry, but it makes sense, especially because the enemy lacks heavy spears and they don't really have a large force of archers. The Starks, however, really need to reserve their cavalry. With their forces so outnumbered, the cavalry becomes crucial, especially when it comes to flanking and routing enemy forces much larger than theirs. The Starks lack the men and also armor and weapons to really face the Boltons in a frontal clash. With the Stark forces engaged with the majority of the Bolton cavalry, Sir Davos, who is in charge of the Stark archers, refuses to fire for fear of hitting their own men. Ramsay, of course, does not have that same problem and commands his archers to continue firing. Only his cavalry forces are engaged, the bulk of his infantry is still waiting to enter the fray, so the majority of the arrows will hit enemy combatants. Meanwhile, Jon Snow is going on a one-man kill streak and baseball bats some dude off their horse. This is really an awesome scene, one of the best in the series in my opinion. There's a lot of dynamic energy going on, a lot of NFL-worthy collisions, and probably one of the best portrayals of what happens when a man gets hit by a horse at full gallop, or what happens when two horses hit each other at full gallop. It is glorious. The casualties are extremely high during this portion of the battle as arrows rain down and men fight in the open field. If you look at medieval era combat, usually when two formations are facing each other, especially in shield walls, the casualties are relatively limited. But when these formations break, that's when people really start dying, especially when one force begins to rout. The Stark army eventually finishes off the last of the Bolton cavalry, but at a huge cost. Ramsay's battle plan is going according to his plan. He now engages the rest of his infantry, mainly spearmen carrying huge shields. He surrounds the Stark army with a spear wall and slowly crushes and stabs them to death. By this point, the Starks are far too exhausted to push back against these fresh troops. It should be noted that the Starks just let the Bolton army surround them. They probably should have tried to break through the enemy lines. I mean, it's not like they had a giant or anything. But they don't, so back to the stabbing and crushing. This scene probably is a very realistic depiction of what most medieval combat looked like. Men heavily packed into a muddy battlefield, hardly able to move or swing a sword. If any of you guys have ever been trapped in a mob at a concert or maybe visited Times Square during New Year's, you know exactly what this feels like. This is the cruel reality of melee combat. There is no glorious duels, there is no ability to show off your skills, there's just a lot of bashing of heads. Cornered and surrounded, the wildlings begin routing, and Jon Snow is run over by his own men. The only way out for the Stark army is up a mountain of bodies, which I imagine is very difficult to climb up. But then a horn sounds and the riders of Rohan, the Knights of the Vale, arrive. At their head is Sansa Stark and Littlefinger. The Vale Knights are not just regular cavalry, they are heavy shot cavalry. The horses they ride are large and heavy. The men riding them are covered in thick armor and armed with lances. These type of units should have no problem in cutting right through a spear wall in a frontal charge and make quick work of the Bolton's forces by charging into their rear. While the Boltons are getting routed and cut apart, Jon Snow still hasn't learned from his lesson and chases Ramsay Bolton back to Winterfell along with the wildling commander Giant Spain and an actual giant. Winterfell is still garrisoned by a small force of Boltons, but somehow the archers on the wall allow these three fighters to approach their gates unharassed. Perhaps the Boltons are stunned by the quick reversal of fortunes on the battlefield. Nonetheless, the giant makes it through the door, allowing a horde of wildlings to stream in. It's not the last time we'll see this giant breaking down this door, and next time he actually makes it a little further before he gets shot down. Or stabbed to death. The Boltons are defeated and only Ramsay is left. He asks for Jon to fight him one-on-one. And of course, Jon Snow loves a fight. So despite having his enemy surrounded, he allows Ramsay to fire 3 arrows at his face before he beats him down into a bloody pulp with his bare hands. The battle is won because once again, one of his Stark sisters has come to the rescue.
Well guys, that is our analysis of the Battle of the Bastards. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification button so you don't miss on the rest of our Game of Thrones coverage. As usual guys, my name is Alan, reminding you that the North never forgets. Or it always remembers. I forgot.